Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble, and I'm here with a special guest, Raven Todd DaSilva, and she is an archaeologist and an art conservator and a YouTuber over at Dig It with Raven. So make sure to go hit like and subscribe over there as well as here. And we're here because she has published, yeah, it'll be out by the time we publish this. We're here because she's published a new book, The Other Ancient Civilisations, with the cool subtitle of Decoding Archaeology's Less Celebrated Cultures. And so, hi, Raven. It's really great to actually meet you over Zoom, I guess, in this case. And do you want to tell everybody a little bit about the book itself?
Yeah, so what it is essentially a journey through 15,000 years of history. And where I want
It's a
to
long
invite
journey.
readers, it is very long and it's over six continents. So it's, around the world in 15,000 years, I guess we can call it that.
Hmm.
And I just really wanted to invite readers to sort of look beyond the mainstream archaeology that we get presented in the media. Because especially when I was first, learning about ancient history, when you pick up any sort of book about ancient civilizations and stuff, it's very ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian based. Usually, if you do get some that cover the Americas, you'll get the Inca, you'll get the Maya. That's pretty much it,
Yeah.
right? There's like the main ones, like the big main things, but there's so many other ancient cultures, ancient civilizations that are out there that cover the entire world that I think are just as interesting. But of course, due to them, maybe they don't have like big shiny gold objects like, Egypt, and they don't have the pyramids, and they don't have as much written record as Greece and Rome have, but they don't get that same amount of, people flocking to study it and then pushing things out there into our society and into our culture. And, also I would say, as we all are know with archaeology, there's always a lack of funding. And so they don't
Yes.
always get the big digs and they don't get the major research that they deserve. And then there's always language barriers as well for other parts of the world. So I really wanted to just sort of use this book as a jumping off point for everyone who wants to just look outside the big major ones that are always sort of shoved down our throats when we think about the ancient world, and to maybe hopefully just look in your own backyard because hopefully there's one that's pretty close by.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I mean, you chose a wide range of them from all over. I think it's a good choice. I mean, you start off with early in prehistory, the Acadians, but you sort of, you covered jumping across America.
Yeah, I've got Oceania in there.
Okay, you have Oceania in there too. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's really jumping all over, which is good. And it's very well written in the sense that it gives people an up-to-date thing. I really like the intro and how you problematize the word civilization, because this is something I strongly agree on. In fact, I was just teaching my students in my archaeology theory class today about the problems with the word civilization. Do you want to summarize some of this for us?
I know the title says, the other ancient civilizations, and it is a bit of a, it's a problematic word. It's often misunderstood. It's very much based off of these Eurocentric ideas of what is quote unquote civilized and what is not in comparison of someone else's view of the world and what people should be doing within society. It's all very biased, and it's all very just like it changes, I would say, like throughout periods as well, right? It's always based off of the values of the period in which you're living, based off of someone who's probably much wealthier than you or much more privileged than you dictating what a civilized person or what society should be like. And it's really used as that barrier word, right? It sets up a distinction between societies around the world, and it creates this harmful environment where civilized societies are seen as quote unquote superior to the non-superior one, the non-civilized ones, as they would say. And it's just a really iffy term that I really wanted to make sure that I wanted to kind of attack right away at the beginning because we use that word way too often without ever really thinking about or understanding where it's come from and the implications behind it. And I was shocked to find out that it was really only first used in France in the 1700s.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, it's actually like a super new way of thinking about, and like demarcating societies and everything. And it was, about the process of being civilized, and it was being superior, with morals and intellect. And everyone else was, quote, barbaric, and they don't have, because they don't have things like a hierarchy system or agriculture or literature, art and science, things like that. And you're just thinking, well, like you don't really need those to be, quote unquote, civilized.
Oh
And
yeah.
then, right? Like, and
To
then,
me, it's a totally uncivilized term. It's just
oh yeah,
extremely rude because it's basically saying we're civilized, you're not. And I mean, in that 18th century, 19th century context, you have like, fairly nasty people like Lewis Morgan, who basically says, society goes from what? It's a savagery to barbarism to civilization. And that's what it's about. It's about an us versus them rather than actually understanding anything about humans. And so it's just
exactly.
yeah, it's a
Yeah, and
pejorative. It's a way of saying, ha, you're not like us.
exactly. And they think, and everyone thinks that there's like this linear thing, right? That savagery, barbarism, civilization, where it's now suddenly become like synonymous with culture as well. Like, oh, you're not civilized because you don't do this and that, and you're savage because you don't understand, art in the way that I understand art. And that doesn't mean, just because you don't have a written language doesn't mean you don't have culture,
Yeah.
right? And
Oh yeah.
it's very strange of how it's like kind of developed and used to create this otherness with
Hmm.
people, where instead of having to, just look at like, well, this is how I live. How do you live? And, there's no one right way to live, even though people love to harp on about it. And that's where this word sort of came in, like civilization is the right way to function in society, to run a society, to be a human, and to do this and that. And that's just kind of putting expectations and rules on people for no reason.
Yeah. And I mean, if you go back further, like the root of it is from Latin civilis, which means citizen, or even it's related to city. And so, I mean, one of the things I have for you is you have what, 18 different civilizations or cultures in your book. Were they all urban? Did they all have cities, or is that how did you sort of demark what would you would include? Do they all have monuments? How did you make the decision?
So I didn't really choose like, quote, civilizations. I didn't try and go like, what do I count as a civilization? That's just we'll say that's the publisher's fun title of the book, and that's why I
Of
wanted to
course,
make
it's
sure
clickbait.
we put it sells the book.
Yeah.
And there are some civilizations in here, but I really wanted to make sure as well that we put in that less celebrated culture spit in that subtitle,
Hmm.
and with the word archaeology as well, because I do go into archaeological cultures. And
Hmm.
I explain what an archaeological culture is, where, it's just us finding a collection of artifacts that kind of look all like they're related to each other over a specific period of time in a specific geographical area. And therefore, we just assume as archaeologists, or we, use our best educational guess to say that all these artifacts belonged to this one particular group of people at this particular time, and that this is how they functioned as a group of people. So what I wanted to do when choosing these I guess groups and societies and cultures and civilizations for the book is, one, make them as broad as possible. I wanted to make sure I captured as many from around the world as possible, that I could, make it as broad. I think I agonized over a map for about a week and just putting pins in to make sure I was able to spread them out as
You
well and be
turn
like,
it into
okay,
a
I think
dartboard and you're just throwing darts at it.
honestly, that probably would have helped at one point. I should have done that, because I just kept thinking, okay, I have an X amount in this part of the world and I need more in this part of the world. So I'm taking some out from here and putting them over there, and just trying to make sure it's as balanced as possible. And of course, that's impossible to do.
Hmm.
But I did the best I could. And then I started to think about, really, like, I wanted to make sure there were a few that people would kind of see and maybe not completely know off right off the bat, but recognize. So, instead of the Greeks, we're going to look at the Minoans.
Hmm.
And instead of the Romans, we're going to look at the Etruscans. Instead of the Egyptians, we're going to look at the Nubians. So we have those main ones there to say, like, these are the other ones that are usually written from, from the lens of the more dominant one that we normally talk about. Let's talk about them from their point of view. Let's give them their time to shine from that archaeological evidence, not just based off like what the Romans thought about the Etruscans, because the Romans hated the Etruscans, and then we don't want that. So
Well, some of them did. I mean, Claudius,
some
the
of them did.
emperor, read Etruscan and wrote a history of it and stuff.
He
But
was
yeah,
married to one, which was great.
yeah.
But there was, the slander of, the Etruscan lifestyle wasn't quote. I guess to the Romans, they weren't civilized in the way that the Etruscans
See, these aren't
were.
even civilizations. Your title is, it's
No,
just.
get it out of there. But it's true, I've got Neolithic community from Japan, like got the Jomon of Japan in there. No one would call them quote unquote a civilization, but they are a very, interesting group of people who they built big, large communal buildings.
Mhm.
They had all these really great, this had the great pot, this amazing pottery. That's some of the oldest
Yeah,
pottery in the
really cool
world,
pottery.
right?
Yeah.
And like the flame jars are still just the most stunning pieces I've ever seen. That's why you can't really see it, but it's in the book, the cover of the book. That's the top of the Jamon
Okay.
flame jar from the
Ah,
Met.
cool.
It's just absolutely stunning. And so I just wanted to make sure I got ones that sort of led to that jumping off point for people, right? I wanted to get ones that were completely out of left field sometimes, but allowed people to make certain connections with bits of history that they might already know or might have been familiar with, and then allow them to just go a little bit deeper within the book and then give them the opportunity to go further out from the book and go deeper into whatever they want to do. So, we've got the Marajoara in Brazil, and you're thinking, oh, okay, they're just this like one culture in this tiny, well, it's a big island, but it's an island nonetheless within Brazil at the mouth of the Amazon.
Hmm.
Okay, never thought about that. Tell me that I want to go now and learn more about Amazonian cultures from, pre-Columbian Amazonian cultures, and then you kind of can go off from there. So that was sort of the main driver in picking them all. I had about 50, I think, on the main list, and I had
Okay.
to whittle it down to 20 because I'd still be writing it at this point if it was more. Um, and I'm already way over the word limit that my publisher wanted. So I for the 20.
I mean, this is what I tell my students. Look, when you're in high school, it's like you're trying to write so much. But by the time you hit university or later, what you're trying to do is cut. And so it's this
Exactly.
total change in mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to whittle it down. And so I really wanted to just go, okay, let's do the cool ones that I know that will give people a bit better, broader view of history, and then also give them that opportunity to just go further with it. And, we've got a huge bibliography, of course, because who would I be if I didn't put a giant bibliography in the book? And so hopefully that way everyone can go, you know what, these people were really cool. I want to read a whole book on them. And then they
Yeah.
can do that. And then hopefully that has a domino effect, right? We're learning more about other bits and like you always get that. I don't know about you when you're reading a book, there's always that one weird like tidbit that kind of pops up in one sentence that doesn't really get a lot of work. And you're like, what's that? And then you just have to go down the Google hole.
The
And so I hope
Google.
that and so I feel like that I hope that I've done that in the book where there's bits of information that I've pulled out that people don't know or that just kind of throws people off and goes, oh my God, no way. And then they get to, they want to go further into that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so it looks like the way you framed each of these chapters is you sort of have almost like a little snapshot of someone's life. Like I like the first one where you talk about Enheduanna in the Acadians. Did you try to model some of these? I mean, I noticed with the Minoans, you modeled it off of a bull leaping sort of fresco and the art that goes on. Did you try to model some of those little snapshots into people's lives off of actual people in some of them? Like,
When there was evidence for a real person,
hmm.
I grabbed onto that because, that just makes everything so much more relatable.
Yeah.
So with the Acadians, with Enheduanna, I have a character as well from the Nubians kingdom. Of course, we have a trader who was named. So whenever there was like a full name, which was very rare, it's only those two chapters actually. I
Huh.
went, great, let's go in and kind of do what we can with their lives. I didn't want to use leaders, I didn't want to use rulers or things
Hmm.
like that because that obviously is not something that an everyday person can identify with. I wanted these snapshots to be, they are works of fiction, but I wanted them to be a bit of a way of people to sort of immerse themselves into that culture or that society right off the bat. so that they get a little bit more familiar with things instead of just having that really dry, first sentence of like the Acadians lived in la la la. This way, it's like, oh, people back in the day, even though we don't maybe have written records of them, they were living lives just as complex as ours, right? And they were
Mm-hmm.
doing the same things that we were doing all of these years, right? We're cooking, we're eating, we're looking for survival, we have friends, we're doing sports, we're just having a nice family time at some point. We're battling the winters. At least I'm from Canada, so I know how it feels to battle extreme cold. So when I did the Tule Inuit story, I was like, this is great. Like I know exactly what this feels like. Maybe not complete Arctic, but I've been in -40. It sucks. And so I was just in complete awe about how they, thrive in those Arctic temperatures. So I went, yeah, we're going to go in that way and talk about
Mm-hmm.
how they, battled that stuff. And they're very short. They're only 300 words each-ish. I really wanted to
Yeah.
keep it quite short, but to just give that little snapshot of someone's life doing something not always mundane, but I love that, like the magic in the mundane, to just be
Mm-hmm.
like, you know what? It's like almost like People magazine where they're like celebrities, they're just like us, and they go grocery store. I wanted to do that with ancient people, like
Ancient
ancient people,
people.
they're just like us, you know? They
And it's
cook.
funny how the very first time I ever went and gave like a public lecture, right? So this is when I was a student and it was at some like high school or something like that. And I gave this lecture on food in the ancient world. And the first question some kid asked me is like, how did they live without air conditioning? And so it's just like people were so used to our world that it sort of strikes you as difficult to do. But yeah, do you want to maybe read the first paragraph for the Acadians one with Enheduanna for us so that we can get a sense of this? And you can start
Sure.
thinking about your what are you going to do audio for this at all for an audio book or
There will be an audiobook.
Okay,
And they did ask me to do the
perfect.
audio.
So you can get the first paragraph done right here and then you can you're just that much closer to done.
Right. I have to like I've been told I need to work on my vocal fry because I'm a millennial, but whatever. That's fine. Sure. I'm actually going to read it from here too, which is very exciting. I have not done this yet.
Off the
Um,
page.
so the chapter is called "The Acadians, the World's First Empire." Also, the book is in alphabetical order, so that's why I wanted to. There was no
I
hierarchy.
was
Just
going
wanted
to
to put it
ask
out
you
there.
about the order. The
Yeah.
alphabetical makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Here we go. The rumble of the carts and the braying of donkeys in the streets awoke Enheduanna. Though she had already been in Ur for many years, the sounds of the city still felt foreign. There was no rest for the countless merchants outside the temple, which he now called home, selling their wares and embarking on great expeditions across the sea. Her father, the former king of the universe, had sent her here to become the high priestess of the god Nana, a position she understood to be more than a simply religious one. In many ways, Enheduanna identified with this city filled with outsiders, as she was one herself, married to a foreign god to help unify the religions of this new land newly conquered by her father and her homeland in the north. But there was a new tension in the city. The new king of Ur, Lugal An, was demanding to confirm his position of power over the city, independent of her nephews ruling the empire. It was a dynasty Enheduanna had dedicated her life to solidifying through her work at the temple. As the consort of the god of the city, her denial to legitimize his reign meant she was being stripped of her title and exiled from what had become her home. Regardless of the dangers awaiting her in the coming days, there was work to be done in honor of the ruler of the gods. Enheduanna dressed and left her chambers to undertake the first rituals of the day. The air was heavy with incense as she navigated her way through the darkness of the temple complex. The moon was still out, Enheduanna's powerful husband greeting her before his descent and lighting the way to the great ziggurat. Once she and the other priests and priestesses completed their duties, Enheduanna watched as her now satisfied husband gave way to the rise of Utu, ushering in a new day across the four corners of the world. The last of her duties completed before she embarked on her exile to Girsu, Enheduanna went back to her chambers to aid her ladies in waiting in collecting her belongings. She took extra care to personally attend to her writing tablets and stylus reeds. Picking up her latest work, Enheduanna read over the previous day's writing. She was impressed with her prose. The tablet was the beginning of the story she was currently experiencing, the rebellion of Lugal An and her exile. It was a holy song dedicated to the goddess Inanna to help protect the dynasty her father created, a call for the judgment and destruction of Ur and its new usurper. This she took great care to not damage what had already been written. While this was not her first hymn, Anadwana felt it would be her most important and the best way to ensure her safe return to her temple and ethereal husband.
So what I think is cool is you go on after that to the nonfiction description of the Akkadians and stuff like that. But I bet you somebody out there is going to read this book and take that prompt and then write a fiction book.
I hope so. Yeah, actually, when I gave it, I kind of cold emailed Eric Klein because I was like, oh my
Okay,
gosh, can
that
you
makes
like,
sense.
would you want to maybe give me a blurb, please?
Okay.
Like, I'm just a lowly
He's a nice
archaeologist
guy.
here
He
as my
probably
first
said
book.
yes, I'm guessing.
He's so sweet. He did say yes. And then when he emailed me back, he was like, I really liked the little fiction books. You should write more. You should write more. And I was like, oh no. And of course, when Eric Klein says jump, you say how high. So I'm like, oh crap, okay.
I have an interview with him as well on my YouTube for his book, the After 1177.
I can't wait to read that one.
It's good. It's good. So okay, but back to your book. So all right, you said that Enadwana is a real person. What's the actual story behind this character?
So Anadwana, she's so cool. Um, she, I just, oh, she was this like amazing lady. She was the first named author in history that we have of so far. So the first named author in history was a woman. I just want to put that out there, everybody. For all the other female authors who were erased throughout history, we have
Number
one, which
one,
is really
the
we have
earliest
the
one.
first one. Exactly. So just we should all just be a little bit prouder of that. Um, but so Enadwana, she, how do I describe her? Um,
I mean,
she
she's
was not
Akkadian.
really, she's an Akkadian. Um, so she was appointed, she was the daughter of Sargon. And Sargon the Great obviously was, the main guy of the Akkadians. He was the one that established the Akkadian dynasty. He created the first world empire, right? Which is no big deal, right?
No, not at all.
He's not at all. So imagine you're like the daughter of the first emperor, really. She became the high priestess of the moon god Nana, and she was the god's wife in the city of Ur. And it's similar to, for example, in Egypt, when you're a god's wife of Amun, for example, it's a very powerful position
Hmm.
within both religion and politics. So this was a very calculated move by Sargon. They're not sure if he was the first one to have done this, but it was this political move to gain control of the clergy. Obviously, that's always sort of what happens. You put in someone from the royal side and the political side into this religious bit, and therefore you get control over both factions, and you get a lot more of that, public approval, but also you have a lot more power. And because the temples, especially within Acadia and all the other areas of the Middle East at that time, they were a religious and administrative place.
Okay.
So, being the high priestess, it was really also a big precedent for future kings. It really just cements your right to rule. Essentially, like if you have the god's wife to be like, this is the legitimate ruler of the empire, who is really going to go against that? Back in the day, not so many
Yeah,
people.
and especially there's no division of church and state, and a lot of the right to
Exactly.
rule is religiously ordained.
Exactly. So, and that was always a big move. But when you put just not just like anyone in there, you put a really smart woman in that role, oh, like you are ready to go, right? You've got everything in your back pocket. She knew what her role was going to be, both as the daughter of the founder of the Akkadian Empire and as a high priestess. And so she wrote these multiple religious documents.
Hmm.
So there's something called the Sumerian temple hymns. They are believed to have been written by her, and they describe the kingdom of Akkad as like this unified north and south, big in like geographical region. It's indivisible. It's strong. It's very propaganda, right? It's that thing of here's this writing that all the important people are going to be reading because they have to be religious at this point, and you're putting these things out there. And it really made it easier for the multiple cultures because the Akkadians were like the Akkadian Empire itself was a conglomeration of a bunch of different cultures living under one. And it
Hmm.
allowed that, these bigger political documents that came out allowed for more integration, connection, that collective identity of like, this is the Akkadian Empire. It's very much like the Roman Empire. It's like, they laid the foundations, I would say. Maybe not, but for the Romans, I can't. That's a really big claim of me to say. But you can see the connections that were that can be done with the Romans, and they were spread everywhere. We have these clay tablets of her hymns in 35 cities around Babylonia,
Ah,
and it was
cool.
so her influence was wild, right? And she also was thought to have written the one I spoke about in that story, which was about the exaltation of Inanna. It's about the
Hmm.
rebellion of Lugal-An against Naram Sin. It was her nephew, and it's sort of the semi-autobiographical story, discusses the rebellion and her exile, and she calls to the goddess, to intervene and destroy Lugal-An and protect her family dynasty, right? She was very smart. And that's all of that is sort of how she became the first credited author in the world, the first identifiable author in the world. And that I think, not just, she just wrote something down and wrote her name on it. She was this very powerful
Yeah.
person in the Akkadian
She wrote
Empire.
something
And
down and it was copied and distributed all over. And
yeah,
it had a lot of meaning for the political, religious, and her family's claim to power. So yeah, that's a big deal.
very much.
What about the other known person? You said it was the Nubian Harkuf. So
Yes.
what's his story?
So Harkuf, he was actually an Egyptian, so he wasn't a Nubian. So this is
Okay.
the kind of first time that this is the only time that I sort of sway a little bit. But because we have his name and he dealt really closely with the Nubians, I kind of wanted to just highlight those bits and kind of show that everyone always talks about how the Nubians kind of were the not really the pests, but they were the ones that always like kind of bothered the Egyptians, right? And then the Egyptians kept kind of like taking them over. But then one time for a whole dynasty, the Nubians took over. And it
Hmm.
was sort of like that weird dynasty. Everyone's like, oh, that's the Nubian dynasty. That's the kingdom of Kush, the Kushite dynasty. We don't. And when I was doing Egyptology, we never really went into the Kushite dynasty. It was kind of
Huh.
sad.
That's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, at least in my undergrad. And then luckily, I think during my master's, we did have a little bit of a section of it, and the paper topic I did choose was during the 25th dynasty. So I was able to learn more about it. But then again, that's just because I chose that topic. So it's not like
Hmm.
everybody gets to really talk about it. It was talking about how the Nubians sort of brought back a lot of the older Egyptian art motifs and things as well. Obviously, again, to use those political things to legitimize their rule and all that
Connections to
stuff.
the past. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Um, but with Harkuf, we have this autobiography
Okay.
in his tomb,
Huh.
and which is really cool. It's one of the two most important autobiographical inscriptions of Old Kingdom officials, which I think is really fun. Because we don't usually get a lot of, these ones from the Old Kingdom, especially. And he was he did a lot of business. He was a businessman. He did a lot of trade with Nubia. He was doing a lot of, political bonds with local leaders. He was sort of helping with like preparing for Egyptian expansion into Nubia. He led 4 expeditions there. Um, and his written account of these expeditions actually is the most important source for Egypt's relations with Nubia at this time. So he was
Okay.
living around the sixth dynasty, if anyone. So the dynasty 456, Old Kingdom.
So what years are we?
Oh,
Ish.
goodness,
I mean,
ish. I
so
want to
the
say like it's
Akkadians,
like
by the way, for everybody, were like 4,300 years ago, so 2,300-ish BC, I guess.
yeah, it's around the
But
same time,
okay,
sixth
so same
dynasty.
time
It's
period
like
then.
2300 to like
So near the end of the Old
2100.
Kingdom.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Right.
it's
For that
towards the end of
big
the Old
drought.
Kingdom. Yes, exactly. And yeah, it was a really cool inscription on the tomb, and I just loved that um, it's somebody who had been to Nubia multiple times. He's done the journey with the cataracts, and he was making these connections and these political agencies. And I wanted to talk, show as well that it's not always these cult, we always sort of learn about these cultures before you get into like, if you're doing it for university or something, you get a little bit deeper into it, but you don't really get much of it even into like grad school, I would say, where we don't talk much about the connections and the
Yeah.
interrelations with neighboring people and how much interaction was actually going on within the ancient world. These cultures, they did not grow up isolated from each other.
Eric Klein's one of the best at talking about that, actually. Speaking
Yeah,
of the people, they've done a lot of
he's
research
great
on
at
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you talk, and it's something that we don't talk about enough,
Yeah.
especially in public archaeology when we're talking, especially with the History Channel. But like in general, no one talks about how there was always these streams of communication, not just like wars or random trade agreements, right? Like everyone was sort of just like, there's always people going back and forth and talking and communicating and moving from one place to the next and sharing ideas, or else we wouldn't be where we are today without the sharing of ideas.
Hmm.
So I wanted to sort of highlight that with Harkuf and the Nubians, and then I go into Nubia talking about, I kind of divided into the three main cities as the capital changed those three different times. I always try to call it like in my mind like a tale of three cities. But then but then the Olmec also had three cities, so I was like, well, I can't call it a tale of three cities because the Olmec had three cities. So we had to
You
come up
just
with a
always
different
wanted to be a
subtitle,
sequel to Dickens. That's what I'm trying
right?
to
Exactly,
say.
exactly. But yeah, so that was Harkuf. He was really cool. And I kind of framed it as like he was like, "Oh, I've been here before, but something's changing in Nubia. Something's going on." And then use that as a jumping off point to being like, "Yeah, they weren't just like the people who were trading with the Egyptians. They were really powerful. Did these
Yeah.
really cool things. They also had badass women, the
Hmm.
Kandakis, the Candaces, however you want to pronounce it, who rebelled against the Romans.
Yeah, yeah.
And but we have that famous statue of the Augustus head,
Yeah,
the
exactly. Very
the
cool
head of
statue.
Meroe.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the British Museum, and how she took it off the statue, and she had stolen, apparently a bunch of statues had been stolen, right? And then there's the one general that kind of like got them back. He's like, please give us our statues back, and she was like, fine, but she kept one and she like put it face down under the stairs of a temple, so everyone that was going in was just trotting over the head of Augustus.
Tapping on Caesar.
Just savage, and I love it. And it sends such a message. And when you look at it today at the British Museum, it's not presented in that way. It's actually looking up at you, and no one gets to like you don't get the cool story of how this really cool woman was like, no, no,
Isn't
no.
it presented there like among other heads of Augustus? So it's just meant to be like a
Yeah.
one.
It's like right when you enter the room, it's right in the middle in this
Okay.
little case by itself.
Okay.
And he's pretty much at eye level with you. And
Yeah.
he's supposed to be under your feet, right? You're supposed to be walking on him. Um,
Yeah, we got to redesign that exhibit. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I mean that's part of the problem with older museums like the British Museum. It's about fetishizing an object rather than telling the story in context, which I think is really important.
but
Um,
it's in a Roman room and not,
yeah,
a room
exactly. Yeah.
for Africa. I suppose that's just I don't want to talk about how Africa is just in the basement,
Yeah.
in the British Museum. We won't get in there.
No, we won't talk about it. We'll just mention
Just it's in the
it.
basement.
But
Years.
that's
I
it's
think
very
I've had British
symbolically
friends.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, British friends where I've taken them down to that area and they're like, I've never been here. I didn't know that this existed.
Yeah,
Because
it's
it's
a
just
real
like
problem.
those two little stairwells, right? That you just don't notice.
There's all
And I'm
these
like, the Benin
subtle
bronze reserve
ways
down
that
here.
we have hierarchies of civilized and uncivilized, even perpetuated in these ways. Yeah. It's a real,
Exactly.
real issue. Okay. This is cool. We got some real people. We have all these different cultures. So one of the things that I figured, we can get to your research in a bit, but so I do want you to get a chance to share your research for a second. But it struck me as if at least some of these choices must have come out of things that you did YouTube videos on. The first YouTube video of yours I think I ever saw was your Indus Valley one, and you have a chapter on that. So it's like, how much did you have a kind of interplay between your public engagement on YouTube and writing the book itself?
So the Indus video, I don't know what happened.
Huh.
It blew up.
Okay.
I
That's
have,
probably why it came across my feed. I think that's how I learned how
yeah,
you were. Yeah.
it is my most popular YouTube video of all time. It has like something like 300,000 views, and I don't understand, which is great. But it popped off. Like it was always doing well. We love the YouTube community. We did like um it was called Discovery of India, I think. It was like a conglomerate of all these YouTube channels where we all made a video talking about the history of the Indian subcontinent.
Is
And
that how that
I
came
need to
from?
preference the subcontinent because everyone complains that I have that little intro and about like it wasn't in India, it's in Pakistan. I'm like, I know, but it's on the Indian subcontinent. I need to put that out there.
Look, modern borders are not stuff that relates
So
to thousands of years ago.
no, it's on the subcontinent. I know it's not in the country of India, and I never said that in the video, but everyone loves to comment that. So thank you for the engagement. But um,
This is
I
why it's so well viewed. All
I
the
think that's
trolls.
maybe it. And it didn't pop off until I think about almost like a year and a half or more after I posted it.
Huh, interesting.
It had like 60,000 views, and then suddenly, if you've seen the back end of YouTube, it just hockey sticked. Just
Huh.
went like it
Okay,
got
yeah,
shared, and I think it went into some WhatsApp group or something. And
yeah.
I don't know how many people are in this WhatsApp group, but clearly
Huh. A lot.
a lot. And it's still my top performing video, even more than 2 years later now after that initial thing. And I did love learning about the Indus Valley. It was again it was one of the first videos that really took me out of my comfort zone, which was great for this collab. I was like, you know what? I've never done the history of India. I had been to India, I think, like about a year or two before, and I was really interested in, I loved going there and seeing everything. And so I went, okay, like what's going on more within that part of the world?
Hmm.
Because I didn't know much about it. And then I was on a dig in Oman the year that I made that video. And we were talking about like some people found Indus pottery. We were talking about Indus seals, and I was like,
Cool.
"What's yeah, it was cool." And I had nothing. I had no idea what it was. So I was like, "This is the perfect opportunity for me to dive into it." And I loved writing that video. I thought it was so cool and so interesting. And again, not a lot of people know about the Indus Valley. We
Hmm.
talk more like the book I have on ancient civilizations. When it goes to India, it goes to Ashoka and that whole part of like Indian history. It doesn't touch about the Indus Valley, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I really wanted to, give them that love. Also, it doesn't hurt that it is my most popular video, so I can be like, hey guys, you want to learn more? Check out my book, and it is actually the longest chapter. I really tried to make sure the chapters were all created equally,
Hmm.
but I think because it was a little bit, because I'd made such a big in-depth video about it, it's hard to cut out. It's really hard to keep to
Yeah,
that
you
word
have all
limit.
that depth. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I cut out at least 1,500 words from that chapter just to try and make it as short as possible to everyone else. And like they're around that 3,000 word mark, right?
Hmm.
But the Indus Valley is the longest one. And I just thought it was really cool because as well, like the people who do know about it, there's usually like that, oh, it was this utopia and it was very peaceful and they just love to take baths. And then then you go further into it and you're like, actually, you know that there's a lot more complicated things. We do see some evidence for violence and all this stuff. And their technology was just astounding.
Hmm.
I weirdly love ancient toilets.
Yeah. I
I'm a
think I
big
saw
fan of
you had
ancient
another
toilets.
nice description of plumbing for the Minoan Crete and stuff like that. I'm a big fan of
Yeah,
plumbing and stuff like that and toilets. I excavated a toilet at Pompeii. That was my first trench I supervised.
that's so cool. Like,
Yeah.
I love toilets. I don't know what it is. Every time I'm somewhere and they're like, that's the toilet, I'm like, Tell me more about this ancient toilet." And then I think when
Do you
COVID
usually
first
ask for
hit,
the toilet paper as well, or?
no, but I did
Okay.
make a video about the toilet paper when
Okay.
COVID first hit. I was like, this is the perfect opportunity. Ancient toilet paper, what's that vibe? And I made a full in-depth video about what we used to use before toilet paper. I learned a lot and it made me love ancient plumbing even more, I think. So learning about like the showers from the Indus and their toilets, like the world's first toilet. We have to give love to the world's first toilet. I can't not write about the civilization that had the world's first toilet. That
Definitely.
needs to be in the book, right? Like again, the magic and the mundane. I love it.
No, I'm with you on that. I think that's where we are very similar in and I mean, look, there's in our larger YouTube community, there are not many people that are actual archaeologists, so we're there. I think there's a difference between people that are actual archaeologists because we're into the mundane, because that's what we actually encounter on a dig most of the time. Like, I have found a tomb full of treasure, but that's like one out of like 50 of my field seasons. Like most of the time, I'm
Well,
just
yeah,
digging up really mundane stuff. It's a toilet, or it's just a scatter of pottery sherds. And so, you have to figure out what that says and like what that means and how to interrogate it, let's say. And
yeah.
that's what we do and that's what archaeology these days in particular is really getting into the nitty-gritty of that mundane stuff. Um,
Yeah, and you have to make it magical for yourself, right? Because or
yeah.
else you're just stuck in the dirt of like, well, here I am in a ditch,
I like the
you know.
dirt. I don't know,
I
like
love the dirt, but it can get monotonous, I guess, sometimes. If you're not in a very particularly interesting bit, you have to be like, well, how do I make it interesting for myself?
yeah,
Well, I did this, or here's a fun wall, and like I need to just make the puzzle more interesting. And then and that really, honestly, I think it helps us with our interpretations a lot more because back in the day, everyone was like, well, we don't care about that. We're not
exactly.
gonna continue with it. I was doing the archaeology of archaeology at Troy, all right, and seeing how us as a profession have evolved throughout the last 150 years. And it's wild to see like what Blagan or what Schliemann decided was important and what was trash, and what we would
Oh
be
yeah.
like salivating over nowadays. Like I like slag, right? They were just like, slag, whatever. And we're like, oh my God, slag. It's just
Blagan had
wild.
some really cool video footage from his excavations. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but like he has some crazy wild stuff of like workers getting into big pithoi, like big pots and stuff like that. And it's
Right?
just like
And no one's
some
allowed to do
wild
that
video.
nowadays.
Yeah, I
I would
know.
love to get in a giant pithoid. Can you imagine the Instagram likes you'd get on being inside a giant pithoid just for fun?
And that's how I always describe Pithoi to students. I'm like, look, they're so big that like three of us could fit inside one, because that's
Yeah.
just how big they are. Like you think about
And
like Knossos, and it's like those massive friggin' pots full of olive oil and stuff like that. It's a lot of olive oil. We're not talking
a
about
lot.
liters. We're talking about,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we know how many people can fit in there because they did it and they all climbed in.
Because Blagan's cramming them in
They all
there.
climbed in. I just think that's like the best. It's like when we were kids and you'd get like a really big box,
Hmm.
and of course you want to go inside of it. Your parents would get a
Yeah.
refrigerator box and you just want to go in. I see those big pots. I'm like, can I fit in that pot? And I just,
If you're a conservator, you do sometimes get to go inside it to do some of the conservation. I have a
yeah,
photo of my friend inside one of those big Cretan pithoi. She's
yeah,
we'll
that's
pop it up
true.
here. Yeah.
I unfortunately have never worked on a giant.
Ah,
Oh my, I've
come
never
to
been able to
Crete. We
fit in
have
a
lots
pot.
of them.
Please take me to Crete. I would love to. I've never been. And
Aha, you gotta
I will
go.
definitely I will glue a pithoi back together if it's just the chance to just pretend to be inside of one.
So, okay, yeah, let's talk a little about your own research. You've excavated at Troy. Who are you excavating with at Troy?
I was with the University of Amsterdam with the Amsterdam Troy project.
Okay,
So yeah, that was working at the Archaeology of Archaeology,
okay.
which was it sounds very meta. It sounds
So
very
you were digging like Blagan and
niche.
Schliemann's spoil heaps.
Yeah, so we're going through spoil
Cool.
heaps. We were also re-excavating some of the trenches as
Hmm.
well to see if the documentation matched what we
That's a cool
found.
project. I'd never heard of
It
this
was so
project.
interesting.
Okay,
Yeah,
I gotta look this up.
10 out of 10 recommend. It was such a fun thing. The first year was well for me, my first year anyways, because it had gone on I think since 2018 was COVID, so we weren't able to like get in on the ground on
Okay,
my first.
that's
I was
annoying.
so ready for it. I had so many digs lined up in 2020. I was like maybe five or six places, and then I didn't get to go to it. And it was really sad. Um, but I did end up being able to go in 2022, and that was the final season. But like throughout that, I was helping doing a lot of the public outreach for the project. We did like a lot of Zoom lectures as well to talk about like we do a lot of work with drones.
Okay.
So we have these really big drones that we're using for 3D reconstruction and 3D modeling of Troy, and like being able to sort of look at all the layers of like what it would look like with
Hmm.
like throughout the years of excavation. There was also some work. that we worked on with excavating what we thought was something that Schliemann said he left to like for us to excavate, but there wasn't really much going on in there. And we're just going through all of the pottery, like the amount of pottery, the amount of slag, and all the different types of things that they were, throwing away in these dumps was just wild. And then I got to work with
Yes.
the conservator, which was really cool, on, the very famous the ramp that Schliemann excavated that he was like, this is the gates of Troy. And it wasn't because it was like 1,000 years too early. I got to help fix that, which
Okay.
was kind of wild to me. I was like, oh my God, here I am throwing blocks back onto it. But the people who work there full time are such a dream to work with. Like the Turkish team were just so amazing, and we've had people there that have been digging there for like their whole lives,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
and
for
they
sure.
live in the town across the street, right? Like they live and breathe Troy, and they know exactly what's going on with everything. And it's such a, it's one of those sites that you just don't think that like stuff's still going on,
Oh, a whole
and there's
lot of cool stuff's going on. A lot of big projects from
so much.
America, Germany, Turkey. Yeah, there's just a lot of different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know the German one that had gone on for all those years with
Korfman.
Korfmann
Yeah, and Brian
was
Rose. Yeah.
yeah, and they still have all the buildings up there, and that itself is like an archaeological relic because you see pictures, that they were there for like what 20 years or something wild. And so they were bringing like family photos and stuff, and those family photos are what over 10 years old now, maybe
Hmm.
more. I forget when they stopped excavating and when the German project ended. But like you see all these family photos, and you're thinking like, well, these kids are fully grown now.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
all these like,
I
in the
was a
old
kid in some of those
kitchen.
photos at different projects.
Yeah, right. It's wild to think that. And then they're just still on the wall, or there's like old bits from everything. So you can just really see like the evolution of a site that's been dug at for the last 150 years, and sort of like what gets left behind from the archaeologists, as
Yeah.
well as how our practices have changed. So it's not just like how we have changed within a profession, but also like what we leave behind in the archaeological record on these archaeological sites. And it just gets deeper and more philosophical and hurts the more you think about it. But it is such a cool project.
No, it's what
So
I always teach students too, and I try to do outreach to make the point that archaeologists have this major impact on what we do, right? It's sort of like that big debate on Twitter about whether to excavate all of Göbekli Tepe, and it's like, no, because
no,
we
no,
have an impact on that site. We leave stuff for future people that have different questions, different methods, different ways of thinking about the site, because that's friggin' important,
right?
because, we know what
No one
Schliemann
wants to
did.
be exactly. No one wants to be a Schliemann,
This is
as
what
you say.
Schliemann did right here. This is Schliemann.
I do want to point out. I do want to point out that I think Schliemann gets a bad rap.
I agree with
Okay.
you that Schliemann sometimes gets a bad rap for certain things because he was just doing stuff in the 19th century way. But come on, let me just share my screen. This is what he published in 1872, right?
Hmm.
So Abby Baker wrote a book on Schliemann and like a museum presentation about him in the 19th century. And so he wrote in 1872, I cannot conclude the description of the lowest stratum without mentioning that among the huge blocks of stone at a depth of from 12 to 16 meters, I found two toads, and at a depth of 39 and a half feet, a small but very poisonous snake with a scudiform head. The snake may have found its way down from above, but this is an impossibility in the case of the large toads. They must have spent 3,000 years in these depths. It is very interesting to find in the ruins of Troy living creatures from the times of Hector and Andromache, even though these creatures are but toads. Because
No
that was
way.
common sense at that time, was to think that kind of stuff. And the next thing he goes on to is swastikas and how they represent the Aryan race that was everywhere. I don't know. My problems with
Well,
Schliemann are different than the public perception of him. My problems with Schliemann have to do with these like little things that he does. He also knocked down. He lived in Athens, right? So I've been to his grave. It's in the First National Cemetery in Athens. It's a really large monument. It's covered in swastikas, not because he was a Nazi. He was alive well before Nazis existed, but the Nazis took some of his ideas on Aryans and twisted them further. But he also was the one who totally redefined like the Acropolis in Athens. If you've been to the Athenian Acropolis,
I
have you ever
have,
seen
yeah.
photos of, I can find one, of the Frankish tower on the Acropolis?
A
It's
Frankish
really
tower.
cool.
I don't think
Yeah.
I've seen that. No.
So the Acropolis, the Franks, when they controlled Athens, like the Franks in France, they turned it into a castle, and it had
Oh
like
wow.
a Frankish tower. This is the entrance to the Acropolis. This is the Eric, not the Erechtheion, the Propylaea, where you walk through to enter it. And this was here. Schliemann was the one who tore that down. He called it an eyesore on the skyline of Athens, and so he had a very clear picture of what he thought the classical past should look like and how it should be presented. And that has had a large impact on the field as a whole. And that's actually where I think that his problems are.
I think that, but it's not just Schliemann, right? I think that was
Oh,
like
of
a
course not.
larger antiquarian view at the time, right? It was think about like things about what the US was building at that time too,
Yeah.
right? All those classical, buildings that we have with the columns and there's again that civilized term, there's one right way to show off the natural, the not the natural world. I work at see, I've been at work too long now. The ancient world. And that's it's one of those things where we know it's Schliemann is a product of his environment.
Of course.
And when you're
But so
looking
is
at it from
everybody then.
a
If you go off that, then you
exactly,
can't judge anyone.
exactly. We can't well you can't judge, you can judge like things that people do that are just inherently wrong no matter what culture you're in, right? And what time period you're in, causing harm to other people, et cetera, et cetera. But
Stealing gold from Troy?
stealing gold from Troy, well, was that gold even there to begin with is the other
Well, there's
question.
photos of his wife in it, right?
Yeah, well, that doesn't mean anything, right? There's no photos of it in the ground, is there?
Well, I don't actually know. Is there? I'd have to ask Natalie
I've
Ivogniakov-Brogan
I've
because
not
she
seen.
runs the archives of
I've
Schliemann.
got the book. I have like Priam's Gold somewhere on my shelf. I need to have a look. Um, but it's one of those things where he is a product of his time, and when we're looking at it from a conservation lens as well, right? Like if you're a conservator and you see that tower on the Acropolis, at one point do you say it's now part of the history of the Acropolis, that it has to stay, right? And again, there's always usually it's a man with a little too much money and power that decides those things.
Heinrich
But
Schliemann.
for that one for sure, right? Um, but so there is always that bit of where we see history as something nowadays. He's also a part of this, where there was that shift, right? Where suddenly history is now something separate to us,
Mhm.
right? During around the Industrial Revolution time, where suddenly it wasn't just like a continuation of our world and our ancestors, our lineages, and all that stuff. It's now there's a them and there's an us. And then there's that very strict divide. And that's sort of where all of that antiquarian stuff comes from, right? Of like, nope, that's, that part is not part of the quote history of it and the purity of the history. And there's always some propaganda behind it as well, right? So it sucks that,
Oh, of
the
course. I mean, the Greek
Acropolis,
state was fully on board because the Greek state wanted to present this classical past. They wanted to
exactly.
ignore the
In the
different
beginning, we
groups
are
that had
the
controlled
godfathers.
Athens.
Yeah.
In the Parthenon, there's still a tower there, a medieval tower. It's not visible, so it's in the corner, and it has a little spiral staircase. I've been up it. You can look down from the top of the Parthenon from this little medieval tower it's
Oh, wow.
cleverly hidden away from view from the tourists. You have to go inside the building and get special permission, which as a student, I was part of a group that did that. But so
Wow.
they very carefully conserve the Parthenon and present it in such a way where that is not visible. You
Of
have
course,
to,
right?
yeah, because they
It's
don't want
always
that
the
part there.
story you want to tell.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you can see that with Troy even nowadays, right? There is a giant Schliemann ditch, but there's a lot of other things that they've, chosen to exhibit here and there. And we do it with every archaeological site, right?
Yeah.
Every museum, even. There's always a bias in telling the story. And that's why just doing your own research is important with it and knowing that there's always a reason why it's presented the way it is. So we would never take anything at face value, which sounds a little bit kind of pseudo-y, right? Like don't, but always look further. I don't want to be like, but it's just one of
That
those
doesn't
things where
sound
it's like
pseudo at all. No, no, no.
it's doing your own research and making sure that we all have that media literacy that seems to be dwindling over the last few decades, where we need to just understand like there's always a reason that something has been done. We need to just understand that reason and understand the historical implications of that and why that happened.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking of Troy and your work at Troy, tell us a little bit about your hands-on sort of the scholarship that you do as an archaeologist.
Oh boy. Okay. So we have to go thousands of years further back in time to get to where I am. I am very much a Neolithic girly,
Okay.
which is something I never thought I would say, to be
So you're a
honest.
farmer.
Pre-farmer,
Pre-farmer.
pre-agriculture.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I used to very much be like, if there's no writing, I don't want to be interested in it. And then I weirdly went into like, oh, there was like early Bronze Age, and I was like, oh, the Bronze Age is cool. And then someone would say Neolithic, I'm like, like no, not cool into that. And then I actually went into um my second master's to be like, I'm gonna do pre-dynastic Egypt. That
Okay.
sounds fun. We're gonna do
The
that. And then somehow the Neolithic just kept like creeping, it crept up on me. Don't know how that happened. Suddenly it was just there, and now I'm obsessed. So it was like a very strange like
I love
way of
pre-dynastic Egypt. All those painted
I
pots and
did
stuff.
too.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. I was so ready to go into that. And then suddenly something, again, it was one of those bits where there was a sentence in an article that I was reading for a paper that I went, what is that?
Okay, what
And
was the
now
sentence on?
it was about the plastered skulls from Jericho. And that's all they
Okay.
said. And I went, what are those? What are those? It was a book about, like the Neolithic Southwest Asia. So think
Warning,
of
we might
like
show some human remains here.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good thing. There will be images of human remains. So it would be think about like Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, a little bit of Turkey as well nowadays that we're seeing a little bit later on. They also appear there. And it was just one weird sentence. It wasn't even part of the paper I was writing, but then I just went, that's it. Like that's my shtick. That's my
Plaster
thing
skulls.
now. Plastered skulls. Never seen one in person, never heard of them before.
Okay.
And I immediately was like, that's it, that's my dissertation. And now it's been my entire personality for like 4 years. Um, as it goes. So the plastered skulls, they were found in the 1950s, first in Jericho by Kathleen Kenyon.
Hmm.
And they date to around 8800 BC to around 6500 BCE.
Okay.
So it's a period called the pre-pottery Neolithic B
Yeah.
because there's an A and then there's a B. Sometimes there's a
And
C, but that's
and
not always the case.
people will probably be familiar with Göbekli Tepe, which dates to the same period. And we have an interview with the excavator there, Lee Clare, on my channel.
Yes,
Yes.
and so I love Göbekli. So that's again, like it was one of those things where I was like, I'm gonna stay away from like all the big sites like Göbekli and all this stuff. And then suddenly now it's come back into my remit. So yeah, Göbekli was a little bit earlier for like it starts earlier, obviously, before the
Yeah.
skulls actually are there, and then it has that longer period of habitation. But since their discovery, I think it's been about 80 skulls have been found. It was this practice
In
that
this
lasted for
region.
about in this region, practice that lasted for over 1,000 years. At the moment, they've been found at 8 archaeological sites within the Levant. There have been some in sites in Turkey, as I mentioned, but those date to a later period.
So
And
wait a second. Plastered skulls. So like they're
yes,
just like slapping like plaster like behind me, the Knossos type plaster on it. What kind of plaster are we talking about? Like
yeah,
mud plaster, like painted
just
plaster, or they're making a wall of skulls and plastering them together? What's going on?
so what they would do is so the treatment of the dead, there was a lot of variation at this time because this is the
Mhm.
time of, within that development of society where we're transitioning from more of that nomadic, wandering hunter-gatherer lifestyle into this sedentary place where we are staying at houses and settlements for generations. It's a very new thing. So it's a lot of social pressures. No one knows, no one's done this before. So it's those things of how do we do this? How do we figure this out? What are our new traditions? What are our ways of coping and living with each other? And, all these new social things that come up. Social pressures is what we call it. And um, what ended up happening is after you bury your dead, sometimes they were in cemeteries, sometimes they're under the floor of your kitchen, for example, and over like under like a plastered floor. They bury their dead for X amount of years until you skeletonize, and then they re-excavate you essentially, and they
Yeah.
pull out your head. Not everybody. We don't know what the
So some,
criteria
yeah.
was. There's a lot of, discussion as to what what made you worthy, let's say, of getting your skull removed. And then from there on, because there was skull removal, and then, that's it. And they were used for other things. But then some of them went even further and plastered them. So they would put plaster and recreate a face
Aha, interesting.
on the skull. So think like CSI,
Mm-hmm.
but less, I guess, with like the markers and the whatever, right? But essentially recreating a face with plaster. And some of them look so real. They're stunning. I don't know how to describe. Like for me, people think they're creepy. I think they're beautiful. They are stunning. They have ears. Some of them have closed eyes. Some of them have like beautifully articulated noses and lips. And they look like a real person. The ones, I'll send you a photo, but the ones from Tel Aswad, when they were
Okay.
found, they literally look like they're having a nap.
Huh.
They're so well done. And they're 10,000 years old. They've taken a bit of a beating, right? But they're still looking pretty good for 10,000 years old. And they have been found in so many different contexts throughout all of the sites. So some are found as, deposits for a cemetery, like foundational deposits. Some are found within houses, or communal buildings, like that's as a foundation near an entrance or something. Some were
Mm-hmm.
found in pits, like the ones in Jericho were found. There was like seven of them found together in one big pit. And so there's all these different ways in which they're found. Some of them have shells for eyes,
Mm-hmm.
which are really cool. Some of them have different type of shells as well. Like there's cowrie shells that are vertical, so it looks like they say the current interpretation is they're sleeping, but then there's also the like Yarmouki and coffee bean eyes for some of them that when they're closed and they're kind of they look like coffee beans. If that's the best way to describe it, literally. They look like sideways coffee beans. Um, they're a little bulbous. They have that slit. They're the same shape as a coffee bean. And were found in caves. There was one at Nahal Hamar, and those ones, they weren't really plastered, but they just had this like netting around the back of their head that was put on there. So they thought maybe that was used for putting headdresses on them.
Huh.
All of these really cool things. And so they have been my obsession for a long time. Like I have
So what's your
a
take
murder
on them?
board.
What's your like do you do like a
Mhm.
bioarchaeological approach? Do you do like a contextual approach? What are you working with?
My
If
view
if it was
is
me, I'd be
the
studying the cowrie shells. So, like
Yeah. I don't do that. I don't looking at, but I am looking at the shells, but in a different way.
Okay.
So, I'm looking at these from a perspective of the evolving traditions and ritual within a sedentary world. So
Okay.
again, as these people were transitioning from that hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where you have like a cyclical movement of where you are throughout the year, or where you're moving based off of food, you're now starting to settle down,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, that means that your traditions are going to change. Maybe you go somewhere for, one part of the year to do one part of your tradition or some sort of ritual or some religious function with other groups of people. Well, you're not going to be doing that now if you have the beginnings of what are crops or beginnings of what are domesticated animals that are
So
essentially
so all these
stuck
sites
there.
that these show up at, they have domesticates, or are they still wild, mostly wild species that are? Because like Göbekli Tepe, people on the internet are like,
Mhm.
oh, early farming, and it's like, no, it's freaking gazelle and wild wheat. But on the other hand, at Tel Sultan, Jericho, it's domesticates mostly, and so yeah. So
Yeah.
does this correlate well with the type of food economy that they're participating in, or
So
no?
that's still part of the research that I'm going into further right
Okay.
now is with the domesticates. But we have Jericho's one of them. They have domesticates, right?
Hmm.
So there is sort of that trend of we're leaning more towards just essentially just settling down, right? You
Yeah.
are working in these houses that are in multi-generational families now, and they're being passed down. And then there's those rules of like ancestral property and hierarchy and all these things. And we're moving to that bit where you're not picking up, and just moving in every couple of months or every couple of weeks, or depending on how you were within previous societies. And sure, you're born into one thing, but like the previous generations and stuff, you're still trying to figure this out, right? Like you look at us now, still trying to figure out how to live in a post-COVID world and
Yeah.
all these things, right? It is there are knock-on effects throughout generations. Like who knows what's going to happen to us within that? But we do see this shifting relation with animals in this
Hmm.
time period, right? So we have this distinction between that sedentism and the wild, and the wild animals are taking on these new symbolic meanings of expression, of like they're no longer the dominant factor in domesticated life. So I'm using these skulls to look at human animal linkages
Okay.
within Neolithic um, sort of imagery and symbolism
How do they connect to animals?
because
Are they found with, yeah, tell me.
so that's where my main thing is looking at the shells, but not in the way that you would look at the shells.
Okay.
So the way that the shells are like they're quote unquote open eyes, if they have a shell, because they have these pupils
Hmm.
that are vertical. And if you're going to go through the trouble of creating a human face and knowing how to recreate a human face, right? Why are you using vertical pupils on a shell, on a skull? And you know how to, at this point, they know how to drill shell. You know how to make a circle.
Hmm.
Why are we using vertical pupils? So that's sort of my area at the moment of how we can use these as a way of looking at essentially, people used to they used to think at with Göbekli Tepe, you go, it's like a ceremonial place. People gather there, you do your thing. Well, what if you can't go there every year anymore?
Yeah.
How do you take that tradition and transpose it into where you currently are? And so that's my research there. And I'm trying to see if the skulls are like that sort of conduit. Um, the Zoom meeting instead of the in-person conference, for example.
Okay, that sounds definitely interesting, and certainly because it's their ancestors, it's that same kind of claim on authority and kinship that Enheduanna at the beginning we were talking about. Sort of, you're going to make that, and that was definitely one of Lee Clare's ideas for. It's a different kind of skull cult there. The modifications were different, but that was one of his thoughts on why it was happening was to sort of, you want to claim your authority through your ancestors and your kin and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah. So hoping to turn that into a PhD.
Cool.
If anyone's funding it, let me know.
Call her.
Uh, yeah, please. Hopefully in the UK, so I don't have to move to another country again. But yeah, that's the dream to turn that into a larger piece of work.
So let's end with one last plug for your book because it comes out. What's the date it comes out? It'll already be out by the time we publish this
Yeah.
video, but
It comes
it's
out October 29th in the
29th. All right.
US, Canada, the UK, most of Europe. I think it's in December for everywhere else. But
Okay.
yeah, it's coming out very soon.
Check it out
Pre-order,
and let's
please.
let's hear
Yeah.
about a civilization or a culture that I've never heard of. The Nok in Nigeria.
Yes, so they were really cool. They were the one of the ones when I was writing that came out of left field for me.
Okay.
Because, if you're in the archaeology field long enough, you kind of like hear names throughout it. You may not know things about everything, but you'll see certain particular artifacts and you'll be like, "Oh, I know what that is." Or you hear the names of certain cultures and societies. You're like, "Oh yeah, okay, fine." And you just kind of move on because it's not something you're specialized in. But the knock I had never heard of before. And when I started to learn more about them and research them, blew me out of the water. They are like it just was one of the ones that just inspired me so much.
Huh.
And so they were one of my favorite ones to write about. They were accidentally discovered actually in the 1940s in British colonial tin mines in central Nigeria. So these like it was essentially what they were found were these terracotta heads and
Okay.
figurines. They were emerging from these mines. And so that was the first thing that, archaeologists were like, oh, something's here. And then they started to find other things like beaded necklaces, pottery, stone tools, fabrication of iron as well, like bits from making iron, and it all fit into this timeline. So again, it's one of those archaeological cultures that we have kind of created ourselves, but they named it Nok after the village of Nok, where the first pieces of these terracotta figurines were found.
Okay.
Um, and it's one of the earliest known sub-Saharan societies in Africa, and it's attributed with creating the earliest sculptural tradition in Africa outside of Egypt,
Cool.
which is they're so cool. And the Nok were also possibly one of the earliest to smelt iron in the area. So
Aha.
it's which yeah, right. And that's really cool to think about like just you don't think about I at least for me, I never really thought of like Western African cultures very much because we're not taught about Western African cultures.
Yeah,
And
which is a big problem. There's
yeah,
all
and
sorts of
so
cool Western African
they were so
kingdoms and
cool.
stuff, yeah, from different periods even. Yeah.
Yeah, and this pot of these like ceramics terracotta pieces are stunning. They have these like really bold abstract features. They've got these like pierced eyes, so they're like their eyes have been sort of like cut out and they're piercing at you. They look like they stare into your souls. And they have these very large heads and very intricate hairstyles. And
Hmm.
they're like have different particular like clothing and stuff. Like we can tell a lot just about these terracotta wonders, which is really, really cool. And it seems that like the terracotta was coming from like a centralized place and
Okay.
not just from any of the sites. And so there's thoughts of like, well, is this like an industry that was, one of these specialized things that was happening, or was it somewhere, a special thing within like just different parts of the culture where they all made in one place and then moved around, where they were, experts just kind of given the clay and moved on. And they were so intricate and detailed that one of them, it has a shell on
Okay.
this guy this one of the characters has a shell on their head, and we were archaeologists were able to like figure out where exactly that shell came from and what species of shell that was. And it's from like far away. It's not even from anywhere that Nigeria, like in that area, would have been in contact with. So then they're thinking, oh my gosh, they must have been like really into like trading possibly, and they had far-reaching contacts with, coastal communities and other places. And it's really cool. I just love them. And I think that with the knock, there's this theory of like these were possibly like protective terracotta figurines essentially, because they've all been found sort of broken, a lot of them, and a lot of them have been found within like garbage pits and cultural contexts like that, but also within um like burial context as well. So they think that they might have, like one interpretation, anyways, is some of them might have been used to sort of stand guard on graves and burials, and then they would be like removed and
Okay.
then kind of burned in a pit. But then not all of them, they were broken. Some of it was gone in there, and then other bits were taken to other sites as
Hmm.
like ancestral lineages and
Yeah.
carried on with them because not all the sites weren't continually habited. They were sort of like
Moving around.
moving around. Sometimes they come back later on, but I get, it's for agriculture and things like that. Um, and it's really interesting because we don't know where they came from. It really just appears fully fledged in the archaeological record. It's
Huh.
independent art. There's no current examples of earlier pieces that, hint at sort of its development.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, and so, especially with that clay coming all from the same place, was there a settlement devoted to making these? It's just it's I hate to say the word mystery, but it's a really fun mystery. Um,
I
of
mean, it's a
just
really good example of why we need to learn about African cultures because there
yeah.
is, if we go back to what we really started with, which was like the definition of civilization, there is this absolutely pernicious attitude among many people that Africa had no civilizations other than Egypt. And so it's like, when you dive into something like the Nok culture and their amazing terracottas, or you also have a chapter on Zimbabwe, and you can see how like Zimbabwe the knock is from what 1500 BC something like that, so we're talking
Mhm.
same time as the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. The cultures in Zimbabwe, they're basically building things that look as impressive and monumental as European castles at the same time that European castles are being built, and just
Yeah.
nobody really recognizes this. They're like, no, it's just Africa. And it's like, that's
Yeah.
just because you don't learn about this stuff in school, man. That's the
Yeah.
reason why you don't know about this. The people in Africa were extremely complex and extremely awesome, just like people all over the world. And people need more exposure to, as your title is, other civilizations, if you see what I mean, because that's
Yeah.
key.
And they
That's
lasted a
key.
long time too. Like the knock lasted until essentially like the first century, the turn of the Common Era, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've
Yeah.
got 1500 years there of the knock existing, and no one talks about it. It's a long one. Like we've talked
Yeah.
more about civilizations and cultures that lasted maybe for like 300, 400 years less than, right?
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet we have this one that was there, and there needs to be obviously a lot more research done into them. There has been a lot of heavy looting since their discovery, of course, as well.
Yeah.
But like imagine that this culture lasted for 1500 years and no one else knows about it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Like it's just
Yeah, the
people need
public
to,
needs to
yeah.
recognize just how much stuff. And I mean, your book, as you said, you had 50 of them, and that you could add another 500 cultures that, like,
Oh yeah,
are around the world in
unending.
different times that are really, really interesting and cool that people really need to engage with to appreciate the diversity of
Yeah.
human cultures around the world.
Exactly. No one, and it's always these big ones of these, oh, the big cities and the large monuments, the
Yeah.
knock, they were autonomous small groupings, farms, homestead communities. But maybe that has something to be said for their longevity that we need to be thinking about more,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
all these things,
Our,
and the
our our
iron smelting.
civilization that we think is so superior, well, let's see how long we last with nuclear war, climate change, and other threats going on right now. I'm not so sure we're so successful. I think the Neanderthals were more successful than us in many ways. They lasted hundreds of thousands of years longer. And so look where we're heading with the climate getting warmer so rapidly. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Raven, I really appreciate you coming on. Everybody go get her book. It's a really good read. And yeah, thanks a ton. And go check out her channel, hit subscribe, watch her videos. So yeah, cool.
Thanks, Flint.
Thank you.